Welcome back, and we are in the last step of our process of interpretation. So the last lecture we talked about theological insights, and for this lecture we want to talk about application. This is the part that most of us love to get to, right? This is the fun part where we take the passage and we apply it to our lives and the lives of our community. And so again, as I mentioned, I want to talk about the process of application, or the step of application. So again, I want to just review the passage that we've been looking at over the last several lectures. Acts 4:32-37. This is the account of the early church, and we don't need to read it all over again for the sake of time, but just want to again kind of just review it real quick. And remember, our summary of the big idea was this. Utilizing particularization, the author testifies that God's grace was powerfully at work in all the believers, which was demonstrated by their radical unity, generosity, and support of the apostles' ministry. This passage also serves as a transition between historical accounts and leads the audience to read or hear the story of Joseph's genuine generosity and Ananias and Sapphira's dishonest gift. Now, again, it's important to keep the big idea in mind so that even when we're thinking of application, our application is within the bounds of the big idea, right? So what are some of the takeaway points that we can draw from this passage? So application. Regarding church community, God's grace manifests itself in specific ways: unity, sacrificial generosity, and gospel proclamation. How helpful is that as a pastor if you're wanting to assess God's grace in your church? If you want to assess how powerfully is God's grace at work in my congregation? Well, do I see unity? Do I see sacrificial generosity? Do I see gospel proclamation? That is extremely helpful, and it's within the scope of the big idea. Number two. Pastors, I was kind of getting to this already, but pastors can diagnose their church's spiritual maturity by evaluating the congregation's attitudes and behaviors. Are they united in mind, will, and emotion? Are they generous toward one another? Do they support the preaching of the gospel? And think about how important this is within our present context. So often we use the wrong metrics, or we make metrics that should just be kind of one small element, and we make it ultimate. Think about how often we assess the success of our church based on numbers, right? Numbers, while it is one metric, actually doesn't tell us a whole lot, right? When we get to heaven, God isn't going to ask how big our church was. He's going to ask questions like this: was our church united in mind, will, and emotion? Were we generous with one another? Do we support the preaching of the gospel? So this gives us a biblical metric for assessing the spiritual maturity of our church that can balance this tendency to overemphasize shallow metrics like numbers, right? Like attendance. Okay? As a pastor, so this is kind of a personal application. As a pastor, I should pray that God's grace would manifest itself in my congregation, and I should do my best to lead them to become a church that is united and generous and that supports the preaching of the gospel. I don't know about you, but these are powerful application points. And again, notice that each and every one of them is faithful to the original intent of the author. It's faithful to the big idea, okay? And so these are some examples of application points for the passage we just looked at, and you could do the same thing for any other passage. Now I want to overview, now that we're done with this section of the class, I want to give a quick overview of the entire process. So, what is the entire process of interpretation? Step 1, identify the genre. This is going to help us understand the main goals of the passage. It's also going to provide us with certain interpretive guidelines, right? We're going to interpret a psalm a bit differently than, say, a gospel account. And we're going to interpret a gospel account a bit differently than, say, a letter, right? So identify the genre. Step 2, After you read the passage, state your initial understanding of the big idea. After giving a first reading a couple times, what is your sense of what the author is trying to convey? Step 3, make observations and ask questions. This is the research stage of this is the analysis stage of your interpretation process. Make literary observations, grammatical observations, cultural observations, historical observations, and ask questions where you're not sure what something means. Ask questions when you feel like you need to do more research, and that'll help you to better understand the passage you're looking at. Once you've done this, step 4 is to interpret the meaning of the passage as you meditate upon it. So revisit your understanding of the big idea in light of your analysis, in light of your research, and state again what the big idea is. Again, think in terms of object and complement. Object, what question or questions are being addressed? And the complement, what is the answer to those questions? And then you want to state that in about 1 or 2 sentences. Step 5, reflect on theological insights. Okay, think, what does this passage teach us about God, human nature, our relationship with God, and our relationship with one another? And finally, step 6, apply the passage to your life and your community. By putting this into practice, we can do our due diligence to faithfully interpret God's word so that we can be a workman approved who has no reason to be ashamed. See you in the next lecture.